Excellence, which is the brand new name of African Accent International, which has been called such for the last 15 years, brings you for the second time one of Berklee College's music stars, who is an assistant professor of music therapy in the Department of Music Therapy and the Jazz Institute. Patricia Perez is also married to a Berklee top, almost a legend, Danilo Perez. She is originally from Chile, and Danilo Perez is from Panamanian. The combination of these duo artists cannot help but produce the best of the best, which is the kind of data that is appropriate for excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros. Tonight, we're going to break down with Patricia Perez's help everything that you need to know about the Panama, its musical tradition, its cultural nuances, its great musicians, its turbulent and triumphant history. All of this to be presented to you legibly, clearly, and passionately by Patricia Perez from Berklee College of Music. Excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, and of course, my own college, my own university, Berklee College of Music. Welcome to Excellence and Excellence's second episode since it adapted its new name. So Patricia, for the next 1 hour or so, I have several questions that I would like you to examine as we analyze the content of your extraordinary book, The Musical and Cultural Narratives of Jazz, the Panamanian Suite, which is a book that follows your earlier book, which was received extremely well, Silence and Loud Music, the Transmusical Journey of a Jazz Musician. Welcome to Excellence for the second time. So let's begin talking about the idea of suites. Why suites? Why did you give this incredible book the second name, Suites? What is a suite?
Thank you, Professor Teodros, and thanks for having me here in your program. In regards to the book Panamanian Suite, the book is called Panamanian Suite because I wanted to borrow a musical device for the structure of this book. So in modern music, a suite is an extended musical composition. So it's performing a series of pieces or what we call movements. And these movements are linked by a common musical or conceptual theme. And I wanted to use this idea of the suite as a metaphor or a framing device. You will see that I have a website called panamaniansuite.com. And there I put all the music that I'm talking about in the book. And the music is actually in audio form and translated to notation too. And you can actually hear every song that I talk about in the book. And you have links to all of the musicians that I'm talking about. So the idea is to have not only to read the history, but also to hear the history.
Okay.
So I wanted this to be like a bigger suite.
That's incredible. And now, take us through the musical journey of the book itself, with its tones, its rhythms, its data, its nuances, and so on. Why 3 movements? Why not 5, for example? Did you choose the term 3 as a magical one, or is there a reason behind speaking about 3 movements of the suite?
Well, in music, usually the suite has 3 movements. And the research in general kind of developed in 3 different parts. So it was it was kind of a natural thing to put it into three spaces. Also, and I can tell you a little more how this developed. So I was happily ever after writing this paper I wanted to publish about Panamanians in jazz, which is actually the central part of the story. But then, this pre-jazz era started to appear in my research. And this pre-jazz era, I call it the era of creating the imaginary Panama. And this era actually started in the 1880s with the first music that the United States wrote for Panama, Panamanian Waltz in 1880, and then ended when after the Panama Canal opened its doors. And there's a whole body of musical work that I wasn't really looking at, but that no matter how many times I would go back to jazz in Panama, this music would haunt me.
Now, I'm struck by the use of the word imaginary, which, as you argue in the book, is indebted to the role of the imaginary in Orientalism by the great cultural critic and political theorist Edward Said, who left us rather early. You have used this concept of the imaginary brilliantly, I thought, very enticing, both musically and culturally. And I would like you to address the specificity of the Panamanian imaginary. Not all imaginaries are the same. They are cultural and experience specific. I am sure, if I am right, that is the case, that the use of the imaginary must also be specific to the Panama. Let's talk about the Panamanian imaginary then.
There were two imaginaries that were contradicting themselves. One of them was the image of the people of African heritage from Panama. And these Afro-Panamanian imaginaries are always shown as, this male Afro-Panamanian, lazy, simpleton, man who is always enjoying and laughing and with his hands in his pockets, never working, always kind of enjoying the natural beauty of Panama. So on the other side, we had another imaginary, the imaginary heroic white male worker from the United States, toiling to build the Panama Canal, a hero. They would triumph over the tropical environment. How would they pretty much construct the Panama Canal by themselves? Of course, the Afro-Panamanian imaginary as a lazy man, as somebody who is always entertaining and happy, never working, had the female imaginary that was this, African woman who was very close to the jungle, very close to a primitive being that was almost like an animalistic object. So, and for the white male worker from the United States, the imaginary woman, I had to be, of course, a white woman from Panama or a woman of Spanish descent. It was pictured in the music as the most Spanish as possible. With bulls at some point, like almost as if we were in Spain. And this Panamanian woman of European heritage, because we're here concerned about being as close as possible to Europe. This Panamanian woman, is a woman that is constantly waiting for the man, that has no agency, that is always saying yes to everything, that is, a total, object, let's say, with no other function, but to wait for the white male U.S. worker of the Panama Canal.
Let me intervene here before you go too far. Let's talk about the Jim Crow in Panama Hat as one of the manifestations of what you just called smartly the Panamanian, the others' imagination, the American imagination of the Panamanian personality. Let's detail that. Let's spend some time on that. And then I'm going to ask you subsequent to that to contrast it with the imaginary of the Panamanians of themselves, particularly of their musical productions. So let's begin with the first. Let's detail the Jim Crow in Panama Hat. I am struck by that.
The Jim Crow with the Panama Hat is a concept that I took from a song written in 1902 by Gene Vaughan and Tom Lemonnier with lyrics by Alex Rogers. And this song is called The Coon with the Panama, meaning the coon with the Panama hat. And I take this song and I make a concept out of this, because this, the image of this, let's say, coon with the Panama, it comes from the same imaginary as Jim Crow. Remember the imaginary of Jim Crow, this happy slave who is actually, remember that Jim Crow was a white man who painted his face black and acted as if he was a black man, a slave. So, but this was a happy slave. So I made the comparison with the Panama, the coon with the Panama, because this coon with the Panama hat is also happy. It's never working. It's always entertaining. You know, he always has his hands in his pockets. And there's also another song called The Panama Rag, which is also depicted in the front page as a, you know, the image of this song at the beginning of the song is a black man, again, with the same characteristics. So this man is always happy and entertaining, strolling around town. He's never working. And, you know, this idea of Jim Crow, remember, was a very important cultural icon in the United States for many decades. And this cultural icon and this way to showcase this imaginary was exported to Panama. You know, the song goes like, we want to be, they say, we want to be more like white folks every day, insisting that what is the style for them is the style for us. So this is a black man that just want to be like a white man. And that's a mythology. That's the mythology of white supremacy. And it gets exported through the music to Panama, in part to create the same apartheid and to justify the same apartheid system that that people here in the southern part of the United States lived on a daily basis. You know, the Jim Crow laws. In Panama, they were called the gold and silver system. And the gold and silver system pretty much paid in gold coins to the white workers of the United States that were building the Panama Canal, and in local silver coin, which it didn't have as much power as gold.
Okay. And now let's contrast that directly, if you like, with the counter imaginary of the local population, most particularly Panamanians of African descent. How did they view of themselves, and how did they orchestrate their musical talents? What are some of the lyrics, memorable lyrics, that you could share with us that represent a Panamanian self-consciousness, self-awareness, self-description, self-understanding, if there is one? I'm sure there is. All imaginaries have counter-imaginaries at some level.
Panama has an incredible amount of different, diverse peoples. Because remember that Panama was one of the first, where actually was the first settlement of the Americas. And transnational movements from the Caribbean, from South America to Central America to North America, pretty much they go through Panama. And of course, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, and later, all of the imperial powers from Europe and then later the United States were looking at Panama because since the early 15th century, people knew the great empires, the big empires of Europe and the United States of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. They knew that Panama was the thinnest space in the Americas, and that whoever controlled that space would have the connection between the two oceans. This was well known since 1513, since the discovery of the Pacific Ocean. So we have a rich culture, specifically from Jamaica. There was a lot of movement between Jamaica and Panama, between Barbados and Panama, between Trinidad and Tobago and Panama, and of course, a lot of movement between the Americas, North and South America. You have to go through Panama. And then later, from the East Coast, remember that Panama was at the very beginning, since the 1850s, and because they built the transatlantic railroad in the 1850s in Panama, the United States built it. Because of that, Panama was also the connection between the east coast of the United States and the west coast of the United States. So Panama has been always incredibly rich in music, rich in culture, also because we have in Panama many different indigenous communities from the Cunas, the Emberas, the Nove Bugle, who are active, politically active, and they have socially active and of course culturally active. So we have an incredible amount of culture in Panama.
All right. Now then, at the expense of belaboring the point, but this is so central, that maybe then we should talk in some detail about the real history of jazz in the Panama, guided by this counter-imaginary within the context of the dominant imaginary that was blocking it from becoming visible. And the counter-imaginary gives it visibility, which in turn gives rise to the real history of jazz in Panama.
Yes. I mentioned in the book that I think the real history of jazz, again, comes from, starting in the 18th, it comes from pre-jazz. Because we got to remember that, the army, the war bands were present at all wars. And the army, the instruments, the movement between the United States and Panama brought instruments and music back and forth from New Orleans and from New York on a weekly basis. Because of this movement and because Panama is such an important port in the Caribbean, a lot of musicians developed in Panama and then moved to the United States. First developed in Panama because there was a lot of musical interchange within the Caribbean, but also within the Caribbean and New Orleans and New York, which were the two kind of central spaces for jazz, but also with South America. So as early, for example, as 1892, we have figures like Vernon Andrade, who was born in Kingston, Jamaica, but he moved to Panama. So he was related to Panama. His family was Panamanian. And he worked in the banana boat, because remember at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, banana was a big, one of the biggest exports from Panama to the United States. So because of the banana fruit company that was stationed in Bocas del Toro, we had people like him that was a multi-instrumentalist who originally came to the United States to study dentistry, which was common also for British West Indian families, but in general, in West Indian families that had, again, a connection with the United States, who would speak English. Remember that British West Indians would speak English and would have English names. That's one of the also reasons why we don't think and we don't question that they're Panamanians or that they lived in Panama or they have any connection to Panama or Latin America. Many of the musicians, the jazz musicians that I mentioned in the book, come from musical families. They are exposed to music since they're little. So when they're teenagers, or even sometimes even before that, they are already, let's say, in the scene. So, this person, Vernon Andrade, for example, in the 1920s, he was already moving from Panama to New York in a banana boat. And he played, with Fletcher Henderson, with Chick Webb, in these famous battles of the band. Later, in 1903, Louis Russell, I would say the first pioneer of jazz, well-known, very well-known in jazz in the United States and Panama. He was another person who was born in Bocas del Toro and who was Panamanian and played music. He was the son of a famous music teacher. So when he was young, he started his professional career and he moved to New Orleans, again in another banana boat at the beginning of the 20th century, and became one of the most important figures in jazz. He was, for example, recording in the late 1920s, some of the first recordings in jazz history. And then in less than 10 years, he became one of the most important band leaders in New Orleans, becoming so important at the end of the 30s that he became the musical director of Louis Armstrong. As a matter of fact, Louis Armstrong's band was called before the Louis Russell's band. So they changed the name to help the career of Louis Armstrong, which is, of course, considered the father of jazz. But we don't, talk about Louis Russell, who was the musical director of Louis Armstrong. But I wanna mention one more, Nicholas Goodwin Rodriguez, who moved to New York in 1928 and became a very important performer in New York. He was educated in the Juilliard School of Music, and he performed, of course, with Louis Russell, with Bessie Smith, with Jelly Roll Morton. And he was an accomplished musician when he came to New York. And he became well known for paying his Juilliard tuition in cash with the money that he earned from his numerous gigs in New York City. So again, we're not just talking about a musician who goes there and struggles and nobody knows him. These are musicians that are very important in the history of New York City, in the history of jazz in New Orleans, and they're musical directors for important people in the history of jazz. And then I can go on. For example, Sonny White, who was born in 1917 in Panama and moved to the United States in the 1930s. He began performing with Sidney Bechet, whose band included Dizzy Gillespie. He played with Artie Shaw, Benny Carter, Lena Horne, Dexter Gordon. I mean, again, with the most important musicians of his time. And he was a very important person in the history of jazz because he was the only one who wanted to record the song Strange Fruit with Billie Holiday in the 1930s. Remember, this song was about the lynching of African Americans in the South. Nobody wanted to record this song. Nobody wanted to hear this song in the first place, especially here in America. And a Panamanian was the one who supported Billie Holiday, and they actually fell in love, and there was a relationship happening, but he was from Panama.
Okay, and now as we are rapidly approaching the end, maybe 10 or 15 minutes left for us, let's now switch gears and talk about the kinds of jazz that emerged out of the counter imaginary, most notably Somo jazz and global jazz. Let's talk about the first, and then we'll end with the second. So let's begin by discussing kinds of jazz.
I say in my book that tambo jazz is like the jazz with a Panamanian tinge. And this very specific Panamanian tinge has not only the jazz tradition directly coming from the United States, and that tradition of jazz that I'm talking about, that is, I would say, folkloric to Panama as well as folkloric to the United States, but also has this other musical tradition, is influenced by calypso, by Panamanian folkloric rhythms, and cumbia, and also Cuban rhythms, Afro-Cuban jazz and Cuban rhythms. So this is a very important style of music that develops a style, but also a culture, the culture of Panamanians who want to stay in Panama and want to mix jazz with these other rhythms and styles. And we have many different, I go through the different definitions of tambo jazz, because of course there is several definitions of tambo jazz. Some of them are related to the music, some of them are related to the culture, and some of them are related to the people. So that's one of the important kind of jazz stories that I talk about. And I talk about another jazz story called global jazz, which is the culmination of the book. And the last, let's say, the last movement is called global jazz. And this movement is, represents and kind of explains a whole new era of jazz. This is contemporary, is pretty much the history of jazz that is happening right now. And we make a difference. I make a difference between global jazz, the globalization of jazz that happened in the 20th century, which, one type of globalization, and this new era of globalization, which started happening in the 1990s. So pretty much the 21st century. I find that there is a new, it's a new world. And we have to change the paradigm of jazz, the paradigm of jazz education. And global jazz, pretty much goes to, I go through the formation of the concept of global jazz, and also the department called Global Jazz Institute at Berklee College of Music, because this also came from Panama. And the department and the institute was actually opened after the president and vice president went to Panama to see the work of the Panama Jazz Festival, the work of the Danilo Perez Foundation, and realized, we want to do this, we want to have it. Can you teach it to the students from all over the world at Berklee? And this was founded 15 years ago. Actually, we're turning 15 years old, by Danilo Perez, who is a Panamanian jazz pianist. And we have pretty much created with this institute a new paradigm in jazz education that recognizes the Pan-Afro-American experience of jazz. Of course, Latin America is very present in this idea of global jazz. And we also, let's say that we expand this concept of the Latin tinge to new frontiers. We bring, of course, jazz, and we mix it with the many different musics of the world, but we also, concentrate in new methodologies, new paradigms, and new epistemologies, what I call the Wayne Shorter Quartet epistemologies, because we try to, bring about new knowledge.
Okay, and now I have one more central question, and then something that I would like to ask you about. It is remarkable that your neighbor, the extraordinary Terry Carrington, who is doing phenomenal work to create the contributions of gender studies, is working with you. You are neighbors. You are at the same institute. So I imagine your future book might probably be entering the zone of gender within Panama and outside of Panama, the Latin world, and then expose the subterranean contributions of women in particular in the silent, or what you call invisible spaces, whose works have yet to be exposed. I can see a future collaboration between you, Terry Carrington, and of course Danilo himself, and giving us a new project, which I could even imagine entitling it The Invisible Jazz Woman Artist, or something to that effect, something much more nuanced than that. That is a future, I think, that I expect you to work on. I'm sure you're already thinking about that because you have your neighbor, Terry Carrington, and also your own revolutionary imagination to embark on this exciting project, I think, that Berkeley could gain from, which is going to be tied publicly for me to ask you to send me a list of some promising students who are working directly under you, Danilo and Terry Carrington, to excellence, so that I can interview them.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the issue of gender is, I think, all over the book, starting with the the imaginary of the Panamanian woman. And jazz is also a system that has been embedded with patriarchy. So it's very difficult actually to get, the women in jazz from Panama. But it's a different process. And I can tell you, because I did go through that process a little bit. And the process is about, it has to do with males acknowledging the women in their lives that made a big impact in their musical development. And it happened that a lot of the great musicians, great jazz musicians from Panama, including Danilo Perez, had great female teachers. So this happened throughout my research, that a lot of amazing female teachers that are in obscure places that nobody can see and nobody mentions, they're there. It's just that they're always in the background and they're not mentioned because we're also obsessed with men being the stars of the show. So the men are all over the place, and the women, you have to really go deep into researching the history of men, and men are the ones that eventually are going to get to those women. And of course there are also other women, but they're few, the ones that I found. Now, I have a good friend who is a jazz singer in Panama. Is called Idania. She's called Idania Doman. She's one of the famous singers in Panama nowadays, and we are actually already starting. We started a research, and she already did a class at the Panama Jazz Festival with concentrating only on the women um, the women of jazz in Panama. But again, we need a lot more time because it is actually more difficult to unearth the women from the history of jazz, because it was already difficult to unearth the men, but the women are even more hidden because they're hidden in the backstories of the men, usually as teachers or as women who were amazing performers and then, got married and couldn't follow their careers, or their husbands didn't like them to be, playing in the clubs, or women that I also talk in the book, women that are leaders, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, leaders in the business of the clubs, in the nightclub business. Remember that at the time, that wasn't seen. Even today, I think that is not seen as a, honorable.
Well, I foresee the possibility of excellence one day to be invited to the Panama Jazz Festival to do an interview on the floor
Absolutely.
of the Panama,
Absolutely.
something that the foundation might want to look at.
Absolutely, Professor. You're already invited.
Thank you so much. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for excellence, with the great professor and the great jazz artist herself, as humble as she is, who is really the voice of the Latina world, Latin world, from Berklee College of Music. African excellence, rather, is honored and privileged to have had you for 1 full hour, which is only the beginning of a lifetime collaboration. Thanks for joining us.